Krista Worth to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, James. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Marianne Engelman-Lado. Professor Engelman-Lado's career has been devoted to civil rights and environmental justice. She recently joined New York University School of Law to serve as a research scholar and director of the new Environmental Justice Initiative. During the Biden administration, she served as Deputy General Counsel for Environmental Initiatives in the Office of General Counsel and as Acting Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator in the newly launched Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, where she focused on equity, environmental justice, civil rights enforcement, and carrying out the agency's mission to protect public health and the environment. She previously directed environmental justice clinics at Yale and Vermont law schools and has served as lecturer at both Yale University School of Public Health and the Yale School of the Environment. She has served as senior staff attorney at Earth Justice and as general counsel at New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. And she began her legal career as a staff attorney at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, where she represented clients attempting to break barriers of access to healthcare and quality education. Before joining EPA, she served as co-chair of the Equity and Environmental Justice Working Group of Connecticut Governor's Council on Climate Change and as a board member of We Act for Environmental Justice and the Center for Public Representation, a leading disability rights organization. Marianne has lectured, taught, and published widely, and she holds a BA in government from Cornell University, a JD from the University of California at Berkeley, and an MA in politics from Princeton University. Please join me in welcoming Professor Marianne Engelman-Lado.
Thanks so much, Krista. And yeah, I was just going to say, you've got to put those up. You can go actually to the second slide. I want to thank you all for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm particularly excited to talk to the students. And I just want to say I'm gonna run through some slides, hope to have time for Q&A, but my Krista has my email and I'll actually put it in the chat. If anybody wants to follow up, I'd be happy to do so. Some of what I want to walk through quickly may be basic for you and level setting. We can go deeper if there's time for Q&A, but I was asked to talk about environmental justice, the history of environmental justice, and then you might be wondering, why am I talking to you all? So from the very beginning of my career, when I was at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, I was asked to look at the environmental justice issues raised by confined animal feeding operations, particularly North Carolina. When I was at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the head of the organization was from North Carolina. A lot of folks were writing to us and saying, do something about this new civil rights issue. And so in the late 80s, early 90s, I started looking at CAFOs and seeing what, if anything, we could do. Years later, when I went to Earth Justice, I asked whether it was something that I could work on, because it was sort of it was unfinished business for me, that I felt like we really hadn't figured out what to do. And so at that point, I started working with the folks that you see in this picture, who are all from North Carolina. I'll point out Naima Muhammad in the white shirt in the front. She was head of North Carolina EJ Network. There are also other community-based groups that I represented and worked with. And this was a picture of the group going to Congress and going and doing the briefing on CAFOs, and also going over to the EPA and asking them to come do a site visit on a civil rights complaint. So what I want to do is quickly talk about origins of the EJ movement, the key principles, how civil rights fits in with that, and the intersection with animal law, focusing on this North Carolina case, and then hopefully have a couple minutes for Q&A. So as a starting point on the origins of the movement, as you know, since the 1980s, the nation learned what the residents of environmentally overburdened and underserved communities have known for years, that in this country, the color of a person's skin is a predictor, and often the most salient predictor, of whether they were living near a polluting source and whether they were exposed to high levels of pollution like particulate matter 2.5. Next slide. So Folks in Warren County, North Carolina, are often credited with being the origin of the formal environmental justice movement. Of course, people who were facing those disproportionate burdens from pollution from local sources had long fought to assert their rights. I think of Cesar Chavez and farm workers, or the indigenous rights movement, of people who were saying, we want control over our land, we want more of a voice. But it was really Warren County, North Carolina, that really had environmental justice at the front pages of newspapers and created a national consciousness. And Krista, if you can just click on that black box, just for a minute, we'll see a little bit of this video.
We will not allow Warren County to become a dump site.
The State Highway Patrol began moving in on the marchers as they approached the entrance to the state landfill. The signs and chants of the protesters made clear their opposition to having the toxic chemical buried in their county.
Okay, you can stop the video. This is actually available online, but I just want you to see a piece of it to see the origins of the EJ movement were really in the civil rights movement. There was a legal piece to it. There was protesting. In this case, there was a community, rural community, where the state was was using a landfill to put PCB-laden earth, and community members protested for 6 weeks, went to jail, used song, and more than hundreds of people went to jail. And that really catapulted the movement onto the national stage. And people in all these communities around the country, in Harlem, in Richmond, California, in Houston, Texas, said, oh, we thought that only we were disproportionately burdened. We now see that there are patterns. Next slide. And so the Commission for Racial Justice at the United Church of Christ did a study of the location of hazardous waste. They published it in 1987. It's called Toxic Waste and Race. And it was the next seminal moment in the movement, because it took this rising consciousness and then did a study and say, well, is it the case that communities of color in particular, and also low-income communities, are disproportionately burdened? Next slide. And what they found is that, yes, income was a significant factor, but race proved to be the most salient among variables tested: land value, income, and other factors in association with the location of commercial hazardous waste facilities. And of course, that finding has been replicated across the country, different regions of the country, and as to the location of all kinds of facilities in North Carolina, including confined animal feeding operations, particularly hog facilities. In Dumping in Dixie, Dr. Bob Bullard, that's one of the seminal books written about environmental justice, said environmental racism is the distribution of environmental burdens and benefits along racial lines, such that one race or ethnic group shoulders a disproportionate burden of the costs and another a disproportionate share of the benefits. And of course, animal agriculture, the community folks in Eastern North Carolina have long argued that that's exactly what's happening as a result of the way in which waste is handled and the concentration of animal facilities in Eastern North Carolina, that the burdens are disproportionately affecting communities of color, and they are not getting the benefits. Next slide. In general, this isn't a surprising this isn't surprising given the history of land use in this country. And this is just one of the Hulk maps, the maps of redlined communities in this country. Any community that was over 40,000 people had these kinds of maps where the federal government was advising which areas were good investments and which were not. And the red areas were considered not a good investment. And one of the factors were whether there were people of color in those areas. So between segregation and redlining, our land use has been scarred by racial injustice. And those patterns were never uplifted. they were never uprooted. So unlike in areas like schools or employment discrimination, where laws said you had to uproot the history of discrimination, land use doesn't have that. That of course we can't intentionally discriminate now, but the zoning patterns that were imprinted as a result of this redlining and segregation were never uprooted. Next slide. So we have continuing racial disparities in environmental exposure, and we have and the placement of toxic sites. And there's a burgeoning area of science connected to environmental justice that now is showing the historical redlining is associated with present day health outcomes and exposure to environmental hazards. There's a meta study that is cited here from August 2022 that looked at the initial batch of something like 17 studies and found that association was consistent. Next slide. And of course, during COVID, we also saw that there were disparities in morbidity and mortality, some of which could be attributed to disparities in air pollution in general. So what all this is saying is that toxic waste and race was a 1987 study that showed this relationship between where polluting facilities are located and race, and that has relationships to health outcomes even today. Next slide. Recommendations in toxic waste and race were that the president issue an executive order asking or directing federal agencies to consider environmental justice or the distribution of health hazards on the basis of race and ethnicity and income. Income has always been a part of this. And that he forms what became the Office of Environmental Justice, that he create a National Advisory Council that became the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And what's super impressive about this 1987 report is how prescient it was, that it really created this agenda, and EJ groups across the country took it on and built, pressured the federal government for all of these outcomes. Next slide. There are other key milestones in the environmental justice movement. I mentioned Warren County and toxic waste and race, but there were events all across the country. This is in Harlem. There was a new sewage facility that was put between 137th and 147th Street in Harlem, which is already associated with very high asthma rates. And the air pollution from the sewage facility, when wind blows in certain ways, was going to go right into this already overburdened area. And the reaction to this site was what started West Harlem Environmental Action, which then became We Act for Environmental Justice, now one of the leading EJ community groups in the country. So this was happening all across the country. Next slide. And people came together in 1991, the first People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. And there were principles, next slide, that came out of this first People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. And many of these principles were procedural, that there should be nothing about us without us, that there are decisions that are being made that we should have a seat at the table on. And I just want to pause because I'm going to get to the fact that, now there's really an assault on environmental justice by the president, and even the term environmental justice, which he calls illegal, like illegal DEIA, illegal environmental justice. And we have no idea what that means. Clearly, environmental justice is not illegal as a concept, and that the right of self-determination is not illegal, and the idea of respect for people is not illegal. So if you read these principles of environmental justice, it really roots you in what this is truly all about. Next slide. So it's about distributive justice and making sure that that pollution and benefits, environmental benefits, are distributed without regard to race, color, national origin. Again, not illegal. It's about procedural justice, making sure that all folks have a say in their future, and substantive justice, that there's equal access to clean air, clean water, etc. And as well as restorative justice, where people have been discriminated against, that we take a look and we try to ensure that all people are treated equally. Next slide. And these concepts were enshrined in Executive Order 12898. It's now been rescinded, but it was signed by President Clinton. And it's really a foundational document, even though it's been rescinded by the president, something to be aware of. And it asked the federal government, or directed the federal government, to take environmental justice into account. Years later, next slide, President Biden in Executive Order 14096 updated the definition of environmental justice, and it's much more robust, and also directed the federal government to ensure just treatment and meaningful involvement, regardless of income, race, color, national origin, but also added tribal affiliation. This is coming right after COVID, and we became so much more aware of the lack of clean water on tribal lands, many tribal lands, and the deep disparities that were affecting tribes in pollution and health, and also disability, that with the rise of climate change, we see the intersection of race, income, and disability, and that quite frequently, whether you're talking about emergency management or planning, or how to ensure at the time of a crisis like wildfires, that people with disabilities are safe. So this definition lives on, even though it has been rescinded by the Trump administration. I won't spend a lot of time on this next slide, but there were tremendous steps forward on environmental justice in the last 4 years under the Biden administration, at the federal level, but also at state levels. That there are, I'm going to talk in a sec about state laws, but there was a rollout of unprecedented levels of funding for communities that are disproportionately burdened by pollution and by the effects of climate change. And this funding was competitive. It was for all kinds of projects, including in the ag space, but also on coastal erosion and having heat pumps in Alaska, and projects that benefit everyone. There were new materials and guidance. Again, those may have been rescinded or taken off the website, but they're important markers, and they're available nonetheless. There were screening tools and other tools that are available, and there was a strengthening of civil rights enforcement. Next slide. One of the things I thought was very cool in the environmental area that is important as a project to take forward in the nonprofit sector, philanthropy, state level, and in the future at the federal level, is this disparities indicator project. The critique has been made in the environmental movement that we often think about not the distribution of pollution or who's affected, but like overall, do we have climate change, or overall how much mercury is in the air? But in every other area, like in healthcare, we think about, are there disparities in mortality or length of life, so that we can track them and get to the root causes of those disparities. And so EPA initiated this disparities project to actually start measuring and publishing disparities indicators. Next slide. I also want to touch on the centrality of climate justice in environmental justice. Climate justice grew out of the EJ movement. It focuses on disproportionate impacts of climate change on people of color, low-income people with disabilities, and often the disproportionate impacts even of climate action, like the move to nuclear or the use of digesters in animal agriculture. If it further concentrates pollution in particular areas, and those are low-income communities or communities of color, already disproportionately affected communities, that itself, taking action on climate, can have disproportionate impacts, and the need for communities to be at the table. This is just a snapshot of the equitable and just climate platform that many EJ groups came together to develop during a number of years ago. It's available online. Next slide. And in the climate context, just a shout out that, as you know, there are significant greenhouse gas emissions from animal agriculture in the United States. These figures are a couple of years old, but animal ag is responsible for 61% of total ag emissions. And in turn, ag emissions, and this is probably a conservative number, are seen as responsible for approximately 9.4% of greenhouse gas emissions. And so doing something about climate change, but doing it in a way that's consistent with climate justice is really important. Next slide. So where are we now? Of course, in 2025, the administration has rescinded the executive orders that I mentioned, eliminated the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, rescinded many of the competitive grants from the Department of Energy, the USDA, EPA. There are lawsuits challenging those rescissions, rescinding various environmental justice enforcement strategies, taken many of the mapping tools that were important to use offline, although there is still one at CDC because a court forced that one back on. There's a banner over it, slashing the workforce, etc. Next slide. So before getting to sort of where are we now and is there, what's the future of environmental justice, I just want to hone in on this one example of work in the animal ag space to advance environmental justice. And this is a case I had the good fortune to work on. I was working with the North Carolina EJ Network and REACH, a community organization in Duplin and Sampson County, and the Waterkeeper Alliance in North Carolina. And it's just an illustrative example of the relationship between EJ and animal ag. So before diving in, let me just say a word about Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and just the fact that it's only one of many tools for addressing this intersection between EJ and animal ag. I've worked on suits under the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. There's, of course, the important suit in the state of Washington, Cow Palace under RCRA. There are tort cases in North Carolina. Mona Lisa Wallace brought this series of tort cases that are discussed in a book about her work. All of this is to address impacts. There's no single bullet, silver bullet to address the externalization of costs on communities, and but these are all strategies to advance public health and environmental justice. Briefly, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination on the ground of race, color, and national origin, as well as exclusion or denial of the benefits of programs or activities receiving federal financial assistance, including financial assistance from EPA. And it also authorizes each federal agency, including EPA and USDA, to effectuate the statute by issuing rules. Next slide. And this is just a snapshot of EPA's regulations, which are applicable to any recipient of EPA funding, which included the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. It includes public and private fundees, awardees, but in this case, it included North Carolina DEQ. And so next slide. I worked with these wonderful people, Steve Wing, who's since passed away, but he was at the UNC Chapel Hill, and he did a tremendous amount of work about the impacts of confined animal feeding operations, particularly hog operations, as well as co-located chicken operations on health, including on asthma, as well as whether that had a disproportionate impact on the basis of race. And he found it did, not only on African Americans, but also on Latinos and Native Americans in North Carolina. Of course, in any given location, it may not have that same disproportionate effect, but in North Carolina, it did. And this is in part why it's a civil rights issue. In North Carolina, again, not everywhere, there were decades of activism by North Carolina EJ Network and others. And what they were saying is, we live in areas that are on the tidal plain, that these are not appropriate areas for the kind of concentrated animal ag, that the saturation of our water is really significant, that the concentration of these facilities, and more recently with the co-location of chicken facilities, is also affecting our air quality. It's affecting our hunting grounds, it's affecting our fishing grounds, it's affecting our wildlife, and it's affecting our health, and it's disproportionately located in communities of color. Next slide. The increase in the number of hog facilities in North Carolina was coterminous with the decrease in the number of farms with hogs. And, you know, in North Carolina, in the 40s, there were something like 15,000 farms that had some number of hogs, not large farms. But by the late 80s, there were under 3,000. And the concentration of these facilities under the control of only a handful of integrators, and then in turn, those were merged such that Smithfield, Murphy Farms and Smithfield control something like 80% of contractors, and very few of those contractors were Black owned. And so this is also related. There's a Black Land Loss Project that provides more information, but this is also related to Black land loss. So it's not just a question of externalization of costs to individuals living nearby, but also social issues like Black land loss. And of course, animal care is at issue with that. I'm focusing really on health and people right now. Next slide. You're probably familiar with what CAFOs look like. This is a dairy facility in Missouri, but it looks essentially similar. You probably are aware of the barns, the open cesspools called lagoons where hog waste is located, and then the hog waste tended to be piped and sprayed on land nearby, and you see the land nearby. There's a lot more to say about that. And where are there opportunities for pollution? The spraying is an opportunity not only for air pollution, but water pollution. The open lagoons are extremely smelly, attract flies, create a nuisance, and there have been nuisance cases. And there are a whole host of issues here. Next slide. So among other lawsuits and strategies that communities used, I represented them in a civil rights complaint that was filed with the EPA. We put forward evidence that there was adversity, that there was water pollution, air pollution, a decline in property values, and adverse health outcomes, as well as nuisances like flies, and that was felt disproportionately on the basis of race and ethnicity. It was unjustified, and there were less discriminatory alternatives to the permitting process that DEQ had, that the permits could be tightened and there could be more protection. I will note, first of all, we did also file an intimidation complaint. We did not file an intentional discrimination complaint where we could go to court. In part, many times communities don't want to file an intentional discrimination case. Not only are there issues of the difficulty of evidence of intent, but also they don't want to alienate. They're trying to find solutions, and they don't want to alienate the recipient of federal funds like DEQ, who they have to work with all the time, and nobody likes being told that they are intentionally discriminating. So it's a larger conversation. Next slide. These are just a couple of the insights into what were the harms. This is impacts on waterways. You can see the erosion, and that spray field spraying the waste. You can see the waste going right to Stocking Head Creek, which is in the bottom left. So it was released right into Stocking Head Creek. And the next slide, if you can go to the next slide, you see that circle around some of the land. This is the density of facilities. So in the middle, there's a little dot, little flag. That's where someone lives. And within 3 miles, there are more than 10 hog facilities. Again, this isn't even including chicken facilities. And each facility has something like 5,000 or 10,000 hogs, which make as much waste as something like 15,000 to 30,000 people. And that means she's living within 3 miles of cesspools that are the equivalent of open cesspools from towns the size of 15 to 30,000 people. And you can imagine what that is like. Next slide. And this was just a picture of racial disproportionality. Those dots are each hog facilities, again, not even counting co-located chicken facilities. And you can't even see Sampson and Duplin County underneath all those dots, and they're not even expanded for the size of the facilities or number of hogs. That's just where the hog facilities are located. And there's clearly a relationship with percent people of color. Next slide. So we did this investigation. The community groups went to Washington, asked to come to North Carolina and see what was going on. This is obviously flooded facilities in the picture, but I think you have to click again to get the text on the right side. Yep. And in 2017, EPA issued a letter of concern. And as a result of that letter of concern, we went into negotiations with then Secretary Michael Regan. And next slide, we came out with a settlement agreement that led to greater openness in the permitting process and some additional air monitoring and water monitoring. Did it end the problem? No. Was it part of a solution and part of a dialogue around the problem? Yes. Again, one of many types of approaches to take. Since that time, of course, there have been additional emerging issues, the growth of poultry, the growth of digesters, and in fact, communities filed, when I was at EPA, communities filed additional complaints along those lines. Next slide. I had mentioned before that, I'm sorry to go so fast, but I see it's 2 o'clock and I'm almost done, that there are state laws and policies that are important in this area, and that's that. Next slide, I want to mention that although there's been so much of a retrenchment at the federal level as applied to this problem, there are reasons for hope. The rule of law and court cases that are a check on the retrenchment and are important. A second reason for hope, next slide, is states and localities have lots of tools at their disposal to address this and other EJ problems. Next slide, and the communities I've worked with all across the country are going to continue to demand attention to these problems. And final slide, I got a chance to work at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund at the beginning of my career with Julius Chambers, one of the heroes of the civil rights movement. And when I went to law school, I went because there was the opportunity to bend the arc of the law toward justice. It is also true in this area that there are many tools at our disposal. And I have this picture of Julius because at an earlier time when some of us youngins at the time were frustrated and worried about whether the courts would continue to move the law toward justice, Julius would say to us, do we think this is worse than when he started practice during the time of segregation? And of course it wasn't. And it gives you hope that if we keep moving forward to address these really difficult problems, we will make progress as well. Well, I think I've used all the time, but I am absolutely available now or individually to talk to you or take your questions or comments.